Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight to the Eugene Mackey Junior Lecture. I'm Montserrat Bonvehí-Rosic, and I want to begin by acknowledging that the San Fox School of Design and Visual Arts is located on the traditional and ancestral land of the Osage Nation, the original inhabitants of what is now called St. Louis. We pay respect to the people of those tribes, past, present, and future, and honor the land itself, which remains sacred to the Osage people. In offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm and support tribal sovereignty, history, and experience by endless generations through their continued connection to this land, the land we reside, occupy, and call home. Eugene Mackey Jr. Lecture honors one of the premier architects of his time who practiced in partnership with Joseph Murphy, a former dean of the School of Architecture. Among other projects, Mackey and Murphy designed the John M. Olin Library here in campus and collaborate with Mr. Fuller on the design for the climatron at the Missouri Botanical Garden. In the spring of 1990, the generous support of Miss Mary Layton, widow of Eugene Mackey Jr., established this lecture to, quote, honor individuals of distinction who have contributed to the quality of the built environment. So I cannot think better individuals than the two architects that we have here tonight, Anna and Jenny French, sisters and partners of French 2D. Within this, I give in the task not to present one, but two great architects that even if they share practice and parents, they have had different paths in their years of formation and their academic careers. And this is key in the entire understanding of their body of work. They come from different lineages of knowledge, and it's clear that they know how to take advantage of this. This is the clear case where 1 + 1 is not 2, is definitely more. One part of this whole addition is Anda, who is currently visiting faculty member at Princeton School of Architecture. In 2022, she was president of the Boston Society of Architects, where she has served as director at large and co-chaired the Boston Society of Architects Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Task Force. Anda received a BA in Architecture from Barnard College at Columbia University and a Master of Architecture from Princeton. She has also taught at Syracuse University, the New Jersey Institute of Technology, the Barnard and Columbia Undergrad Architecture Program, and the MIT Department of Architecture. The other half is Jenny, assistant professor in practice of architecture at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, where she has also served as coordinating faculty in architecture for the Design Discovery Program since 2017. She received a BA in Art History and Studio Art for Dartmouth College and a Master of Architecture from the Harvard Graduate School of Design. She is a recipient of Harvard's Julia A. Appleton Traveling Fellowship, and she has been a visiting artist at the American Academy in Rome. Jenny has taught also at Northeastern University, Tufts University, the Boston Architectural College, and served as a thesis advisor at RISD. Together, they add more than two. French 2D has multiple dimensions. I just will describe you three to start. Many others will resonate during the course of the lecture. The firm has a clear socialist dimension because their work is social, not just integrating different actors of the social collective, but also the socialization that implies inhabiting their projects. From this cozy blanket, emergency blanket wrap on a dinner table to diverse ecosystems of family units on the recent project Bay State Co-Housing, a project exploring natures of Boston stress housing market and transforming it into a social experiment, an urban social shaker. French 2D can also be described as communist because common is a clear thread, a central piece of their designs, a core topic that waves through the projects the common sense of a space, with the common agreement across their users in every step of their design process. A special attention is given to the common spaces and the infused sense of co-authorship and agency that all of their design projects participate. Just adding one more, I would say a formalist dimension. Here, I'm not describing a gracious formalism, but instead a form that constricts in one hand and gives freedom in many others, full of small gestures of generosity and empathy towards the inhabitants of the spaces. They draw freedom from the microspaces of their studios or the slightly twisted, colorful frame windows to the wrapped benches on their shared spaces or gentle building setbacks to push urban domesticity inside out. It might seem that I have used such provocative words to describe this firm, but in fact, they are just the right ones. They are clearly the vocabulary that we need in the time that we are living. To conclude, I will list you some of the most recent awards and distinctions of their practice. The nomination for the Mies Crown Hall Americas Prize, the Architecture Review for Emerging Award, being finalist, the Architect Magazine Progressive Award, the Architecture Record Design Vanguard, the MoMA PS1 competition in which they were finalists, and their contribution to the 13th Architecture Venice Biennale. Their work has been published in Domus, Metropolis, Azure Magazine, and the Architect's newspaper, among others. And I will conclude by mentioning their texts, Constructing Commonality, Autoethnography in Architectural Pedagogy and Practice, a manifesto of their approach to architecture that was presented at the last ACSX conference in Vancouver, which I highly recommend to all the students here, because it embraces the necessity of empathy in our profession, an attitude that can be easily get lost. With this, I will leave the stage to our guests, but without us not asking you, helping me welcome Anda and Jenny French.
Okay, and for our first slide.
What happened?
Hang on. I think it got clear. There we go. Okay,
We're back.
thank you, Tot, for that really stunning introduction. It's been a pleasure to know you for many years and to work with you. Thank you so much to the College of Architecture for having us here. And we're just so pleased to be able to share some work with you all tonight, hopefully not go on too long, and leave time for questions as well, of course.
So we generally start, and it was so kind of you to mention this autoethnography piece, because we've been talking about that a lot, and sort of how do you talk about oneself without being autobiographical, but placing yourself in a context, and then being able to think through the work in a sort of network of meaning. So it often helps to describe that the French 2D, the 2D in our name, references actually a shared eye condition that we both have that affects our depth perception. But it also serves as a sort of stand-in for the idea of doubling perspectives. And that's sort of the ethos of our practice. And it sort of leads the idea of collective creation. If there is the smallest form of a collective is two and can build from there, that's sort of who we are and how we'd kind of like to talk about our work tonight. We love when we get to lecture together, so thank you so much for bringing us both here. So that's the title tonight is Together Again.
Also the title of one of my favorite songs from the movie Muppets Take Manhattan.
If anybody, yeah. No.
Sidebar. All right, too old.
Too old. So we made this graph quite recently, and it helped us to kind of think through and look at the last 10 years of our work, which has generally looked to novel negotiations and collective capacities for what we might call an alternative future comfort, from co-housing for families of choice to a 40-foot wearable tablecloth and speculative layered facades. French 2D's practice calls attention to the material and the social arrangements for a new conception of comfort in the built environment. We often talk about that as both thermal comfort, sort of literal, and social comfort, and we'll talk a little bit about that. This also is a graph that describes the linearity of time from 2012, sort of the beginning, that MoMA PS1 proposal, all the way to 2024 and our most recent work. And then the y-axis is really about scale. So our work might start with teapot and might go all the way up to projects that are 300,000 square feet. So we're sort of always somewhere, you can always find us somewhere on this graph. And what we really are interested in is the idea of how we've tied some of these things together and how a lot of the connections are nonlinear. So it might be good to start with the co-housing as a way to frame all of that.
Yeah. And so, yes, somewhere on the upper end of this chart is the Bay State Co-Housing Project. And it's a project that really addresses work at sort of all scales and registers of our practice. And it's really about both process and a product of collective work, policy, people, formal legibility, and playfulness. So kind of all of these registers that Todd has just spoken of. And this was designed through a multi-year participatory process. And is about questioning the definition of family and household, sort of in both legal and formal structure. And here you'll see the center of this open courtyard building, which is now hung with hammocks. Actually, we were just there last week having lunch, and a sort of assortment of various bikes and other furniture. And this project was really actually only possible because our practice had to advocate for a new co-housing ordinance, actually, as we worked with a city councilor to make it possible after a building moratorium. And so we might characterize this sort of shift in practice model that we had to take on here as widening our role of architects to become active policy advocates, right? And this is about inclusionary zoning, here acknowledging that value in density and just slightly higher density, and only a 3-story building, in fact, that was near an urban core, 1,000 feet from a train station, that otherwise would not have been built had we not worked together and been able to write an ordinance that involved self-governance models, collective space, things that were really written into also a formal zoning definition for this town just north of Boston. And this project is owned and operated by 30 households. It's self-governed, it was self-financed and self-developed, and it leverages the collective capacity of those 30 households to operate as a large, sort of, if complex, extended family. And here, drawings and images are really about revealing the relationship between density, community, and affordability, right? So we are creating in this building an informal collective awareness through this courtyard. That's the backbone of shared childcare, resource and social well-being, right? So this idea of external walkways and open courtyard that are really allowing you to see your neighbors at multiple times during the day. And these are sort of invented arrangements in plan and section that are questioning the typical multifamily double-loaded corridor. So there's really virtually no portions of a double-loaded corridor within the project, and instead are about producing visibility across levels and terraces and through windows.
It always feels really important at this moment to say when we say we eschewed the double-loaded corridor, that it was for the same price as the sort of typical multifamily double-loaded corridor building, and that sort of rings through as you start to see the details.
Yeah, this is by no means a luxury building, right? Built with the same materials and budget of a really strict kind of multifamily building. And really we're reflecting on how sort of scale and time shifts along with so many different hats that we're wearing. So this was a 7-year period, and we had to design a sort of workday that is accommodating for ourselves within our practice, large scales of urban policy, again, with the zoning, but alongside moments of sort of different scales of domestic intimacy. So what would cozy public space mean, for instance? So the model of co-housing is about individual units, but also large shared kitchens, dining rooms, children's space. So this is my daughter looking into the window from the entryway underneath the main stair into the kids' room, or another view through the kitchen door out to the banquette, where people are, working during the day, and then 100-person dinners happen, once or twice a week, either as potluck or a point system that we just heard about, where they all kind of exchange and barter points for cooking and value. And this is really also a project that we got to sort of test formal play within limits at these sort of interior courtyard moments of human scale, looking at how simple materials and color produce affect and playfulness. And maybe one of the kind of most exciting and nerve-wracking parts of this project for us was actually getting to the end of the line of a multi-year. This building was 7 years in the making, including 3+ years of co-design workshops. But getting to the color palette was actually probably the hardest part. And so we exactly agree. Getting 100 people to agree on a set of colors that were going to characterize both their shared space but also their identity within a community. And we were really sort of so happy and excited that they were on board for testing out a palette of new colors. And we were happy to see, So Will in Brooklyn following suit with their pink building. I'm kidding.
Reclaiming pink.
And we can I think this idea of this sort of pink or softness is actually pretty important to the identity of the building as well.
So if we were to situate that Bay State Commons project work, which was, as Jenny said, from start to finish, 6 years, not typical of many architecture projects because it had so much of the social work and then the sort of zoning work that had to happen. We might look at various projects that began and were completed in the time between its start and finish, from 2016 to 2023. We like to joke that also 4 children showed up during that time too. So there's the work, there are the kids, there are all the pieces of the puzzle. So while we were running co-design workshops with Bay State Co-Housing, we were wrestling with a guiding principle of historic preservation in the outlier lofts, which is this building here, something we had to rewrite just as we had to invent a new zoning ordinance for co-housing. In Boston, the preservation societies in each neighborhood have a lot of political strength, a lot of political power, and the conversations have a lot to do with the difference between preserving elements of history just as they were versus being able to be in conversation with them. So a lot of our work has been, how do you develop these conversations rather than just mimicking? So here, the building's elevations collapse 200 years of history, reordering what was once a pair of row houses, then an infamous bar, into 3 flats. I think everyone has aged out of knowing the bar it was in the movie The Town, if you've ever seen that with Ben Affleck. That was the building before we redid it. Its 2 primary elevations address 2 very different audiences, the Boston skyline and one of Boston's oldest neighborhoods, employing different configurations and scales. In our practice, we do play with representation, both as we're designing and then after the fact, in order to kind of continue these conversations and draw out what's been important to us. So in this, both in the drawings on the left, you see the collapsed plans and elevations of the building in the 19th, 20th, and then 21st century in different colors, and the sort of imagined plans that helped us draw through what that building would become. And then even in the final photograph, so this is the final photograph of the project, and instead of an elaborately outfitted interior, we used furniture as proxies for the layered inhabitations of the final photographs. And this sort of echoes the strange negotiation between living present and preserved past. So the photograph is real, but the furniture then is actually is rendered into it. We sort of borrowed this from the world of staging for a lot of real estate, where you might see the sort of awkward staging of a building. So at the opposite scale of our building practice, we work on these very small objects for sharing as a vehicle to study both the effects of slight strangeness and vulnerability. This project we like to pair with the outlier lofts because it also has a formal investigation. We investigate the corner and the interpretation of the corner. So if in outlier lofts we are trying to accommodate and speak to two different audiences, one the kind of forward-looking progress of the city that faced the skyline, and the other the preserved neighborhood, the oldest neighborhood in Boston, and its sort of face that turns the corner and faces that edge. Here, the corner of the teapot turns to actually invite multiplicity. This is to disarm and connect through this sort of shared defamiliarization in which we cede our role to the agency of the object. Here, the teapot can act as a convener. It's the site of the smallest collective. Multiple hands can actually be used in these teapots. They invite multiple ways of using the tea set together, which of course invites awkwardness, but we actually find that inviting that kind of awkwardness and vulnerability brings people together and starts new conversations. In this instance, our practice sees industrial objects like buildings. Their profiles as bas-relief elevations to be encountered individually. And then corners, as I was describing, must negotiate the breaks and wrestle with continuity. So as a result, we might argue that encoded in the object itself are multiple frontalities. Just like our previous project, Outlier Loft, there are multiple ways to read and to use it simultaneously. You want to jump in?
And Todd also mentioned some textile work. So I think across that initial spectrum, we saw both scale, we saw time, and the other sort of component is starting to play with material. And so just as we were finishing the construction documents on that Bay State co-housing project, which was 45,000 square foot building, we were working on this 45 square feet of space that we called Cozy Wall. And it's really a set of partially engaged bodies, right, that produce a spatial bas-relief, something that through our lack of depth perception we're interested in, just like in the teapot, and a sort of weird and viscerally familiar space. So here it's inserting a kind of domestic realm into the lobby of an architecture school, the GSD.
Historically fairly cold.
A fairly cold place, right? And this was actually... yes, an exhibit hall, typically to show off the work of a firm or a course, and instead we'd said, why don't we take this budget and see what's the strangest thing that we could do that would actually get people to stop there and use it as a space. And so these bodies are really about privileging a kind of emotional connection as much as ergonomics, and are really kind of against a sort of efficiency, but instead about somewhere navigating this scale of the human, the spatial. So we are kind of evading any category here of industrial design or furniture design, and see this really as a social convener again. And so again, back to Bay State Commons, alongside every phase of that project, we were working on other series that were about building these kind of proto-collectives. So with the co-housing project, we often would talk to the residents, and still do, that the community was really constructed, and it sounds kind of cheesy, but it was constructed before the building was at all, or was even occupied, through the potlucks, through the meetings, through all of the ways in which this group had to come together. And so here at this other small scale of our practice, on the right is another project that we call Dinner Cozy. So on the left, Wall Cozy, we then repurposed that same material. And it's about making visible social and physical negotiations of a dinner table. So this is a many-armed tablecloth, and it could play host to up to 28 guests. Here you see it in top view, and then also inside at another installation in Brooklyn. And it's about insisting on a kind of acknowledgement of presence, right? Enveloping chairs, providing warmth. These are survival blankets from REI. You can go deep on YouTube and look at the layering of your sleeping bag, your Tyvek sheet, and the survival blanket to make sure you're not, freezing or condensating too much at the inside. So much like a wall section, and we'll get to that in a minute. Mm-hmm. But here again, the sort of negotiation that ensues at a dinner table with this object is about a sort of established set of conventions, right? Making visible the formal etiquette and the sort of personal thermal comfort that might allow for humor or play for pro-social ends. And so this is a sort of other dimension that we found ourselves, in this last 12-year period, which is, instead of just being designers, we like this idea of kind of event production. So this was on a cold October afternoon, using this exact same installation to sort of test its capacity to hold an event on a busy street corner and to keep people warm. So this series was also connected to a 2017 installation that we started kind of early on that we called Place Setting, employing a kind of another experimental table configuration and reflectivity. And so this was a sort of week-long dinner series that were about participation, sort of scripted, or not scripted, but a menu of conversation topics convened around a set of grassroots and sort of legacy institution people in the city of Boston, all working on different issues around economic inequality, civic media, cooperative economies. And what we did was essentially take an open-sided shipping container, which you see a model of on the left, and produce a sort of half proscenium stage with a reflective background and a set of IKEA tables with extended legs, right? And so this table could move and reconfigure into all of these shapes you see on the left. And at each meal, we would try out a different kind of uncommon way of hosting a party so that, hierarchy, new connections would have to be made laterally, horizontally, up and down across a sectional divide.
I think there was one last point that you had made that we were talking about. I thought it was really interesting because part of this was on Boston City Hall Plaza, which is this very large and open plaza in the center of the city. And the notion that you could invite eavesdropping, that in fact the dinner was the important event, and yet the people walking around the plaza became sort of bystanders or maybe willing or unwilling participants in this dinner and part of the conversation, really gets us thinking about how the sort of architectural object is photographed and understood. So some of those photographs where you see people standing behind the photograph that feels like the stage starts to come into play in this next project. So that small scale project, the shipping container size, was immediately followed by a large textile commission. And here we were asked to wrap this really large and visible garage, which we approached through the multi-scale articulation of its facade. So this is, I think, 25,000 square feet of facade to wrap an existing 300,000 square foot garage, a bit of an eyesore in the middle of Cambridge. So we ended up exploring this project along with the human scale through our handmade dresses. So that's a little bit of bringing in. You'll find that we don't love to do the straight-laced architectural photo shoot that whenever we go to photograph the work, we're interested in how maybe bringing a kind of scene or a narrative to the way that we document might actually lift up and bring some of the larger conversations about the work. So here we made these two dresses. We thought of ourselves as sort of both the color palettes that had been suggested to the city, but roundly were rejected because this building was not just a graphic. It wanted to serve as a kind of background noise of the city. So here we thought of ourselves as these sort of pieces that were scattered throughout the site and might help to understand how the scale changes. So the photographs are narrated by the movements of our body throughout this, but the design of the project begins in the site plan on your left, sorry. We were thinking about this building as having sort of four scales, one intimate when you're walking by at a very close scale, one at a very long kind of view from a long street that's along this R&D sort of corridor in Cambridge, and then the sort of middle scales where the building blurs and becomes part of the city's landscape. So you can see that the pattern, the massive textile drawing, starts to wrestle with that relationship between the moments where you might see surface and you might read volume, and where those two things sort of switch back and forth. The moment on the left here is when you're actually inside of the building and you can read through that print. It sort of is the only moment where you can actually stand right next to the scale of that pattern. So this difference, this sort of tension between drawing and building comes up. Our practice continues to develop this, and we're focused on an idea of a sort of comfort. It's no longer a commodity, but a sort of state to be negotiated emotionally and physically. And in this case, we're very literal about comfort, right? Our own sort of discomfort of being photographed, of being associated, right? Of the idea that the figure of the designer is often photographed in very specific ways with the work. We wanted to sort of think about the issues of gender, the issues of representation that might be pulled out of that project or pulled into the project if we became these sort of scale figures. There's a different kind of comfort then that we're interested in, the sort of self-reflexive practice that allows us to understand this thread that begins early in our work. And it's based on the conceptual underpinnings of our own education and our own sort of outlier paths. So if we go all the way back to the beginning, to 2013, and this MoMA PS1 Young Architects Finalist project, this proposal was at a moment when many of you are too young to know this, but most of the proposals were all sort of big proposals, big installations at the center of this courtyard at MoMA PS1. And we were sort of interested in lining the courtyard and thinking about some of the different kinds of personalities, maybe our own personalities that might sort of began it, that might be interested in occupying that courtyard differently, right? Like the wallflower, the two people who want to talk in the corner, the people who actually are more interested in finding the sort of nooks and crannies of that space.
And this PS1
We should explain what
was
it
maybe
is.
sort of the height of installation architecture as a way to test ideas. It's a program that no longer runs, but every summer architects would compete, and one group would build a sort of heroic or playful or all of the above, more or less set piece to host a series of summer parties
And concerts, yep.
Yeah, exactly, in a courtyard in Queens. Yeah.
And it wasn't until we looked back that we realized that so much of what we were interested in here was a level of comfort, right? In this case, it was a sort of social comfort of bringing people together in this courtyard and allowing for the sort of maybe also the neurodivergence of how one even experiences the noise and activity of these kinds of events. And then the range of comfort levels and situations that could occupy these screens is also the beginnings of our kind of representational work, where we're thinking about the object as never being static because it's always being occupied in different ways, right? So this element of time being something that we're trying to represent and think through both the sort of physical occupation, the sound, the ways in which those things might produce entirely different atmospheres. And that leads into a sort of pseudomorphic relationship to another project.
Yeah, so it's from a sort of, instead of an object in a courtyard, we created a kind of a village of these little, proto-formal gable house characters. And then this sort of last architecture project is one that we'll hope we'll pick back up that we've been working on recently, another co-housing community in mid-coast of Maine. And this is sort of a current project that we're excited about thinking through these social configurations, these set pieces in a non-urban setting. So this is mid-coast co-housing. It's a net zero intergenerational co-housing community, sort of just getting underway. And our work has been to plan help this group purchase town-owned land, a former farm in rural Maine. And it's really about preserving a sort of existing forest, consolidating footprints, and pushing sort of the boundaries of, how you live amongst your neighbors on a piece of land. And so all of these housing configurations are about producing kind of groupings of different unit types that share a sort of proximity even across their units, so maybe a duplex next to a single family, et cetera. And this configuration then, also produces a series of characters to be developed across a kind of hilly landscape that we now, of course, see the sort of genesis in that previous project.
An interesting element of this has a lot to do with issues of resource sharing and again, I know I've said comfort too many times, but the comfort in proximity is really interesting in this. The piece of land that the city owns are these former farms that are now all forested, and other proposals have used so much of that land and taken down so many of the trees in their proposals. But in this case, because it was a co-housing community, the idea that you could use just 10% of the land to house the same number of people meant that we could play with these issues of proximity, social and physical, and create a kind of a set of maybe courtyards that exist between each of those, each of the houses, in order to kind of think through, why live in the woods if you're going to just be 15 feet away from someone else? The answer becomes because that actually brings you out of your shell. You start to create that community in the woods. So we've been really excited about this project and hoping that it's moving forward.
All right, and lastly,
This is fast.
Yeah.
It's faster than usual.
we're bringing up this sort of last textile piece that gets back up to the building scale, a project called House Coat, right, which is current work in our office, sort of speculating on looser building envelopes, right? So deploying lessons from conditioning the body, right? So this idea of layered dressing when you're hiking or camping, but seen at the building scale. So earlier textile models you see on the left, a show we did called House Clothes, right, or about kind of lifting the curtain on the multiple lives of inhabitants. On the left, you see a model of a building we didn't show, 180 micro units in Greater Boston. But here, thinking about negotiating a zone that's in between the inside and the outside, that is both social and thermal. And so as the building, right, this is a sort of speculation, actually redressing that outlier loss project we showed a few projects back. So it's really about the building kind of taking on or off layers, right? And thinking again of inside conditioned space or in between conditioned space is sort of no longer a resourced commodity, something that actually needs energy to keep it and sustain it, but something that might be temporal and negotiated as well. So that, what we're all hoping for is maybe an adjustment where we could delight, right, maybe in extended periods where we're not in the perfect 72-degree interior, but we sort of stretch the boundaries of what, our own social and kind of physical needs could be. And lastly, this is a piece that kind of helps wrap up maybe these threads of work that I wrote about in an issue of Domus a year ago called New Comforts Await. And one thing that we kind of want to emphasize maybe, and this is one of the hard things about being in school and even in academia in general, is that we hear these words like care and collective or co-housing, co-ops, comfort, right? And on some level, we sort of cycle through them, we digest them, but we kind of want to invite everyone to not kind of move on to the next buzzword or find a sort of complacency with the way we're talking about some of these kind of critical issues within the discipline and the practice, but maybe figure out either synonyms, new ways in which we can find our own practice going forward.
And a lot of that is this kind of practice of sitting with what you have been working on, where your work might go. I think Jenny and I are in the midst of talking about what a conference might be if it's blank by any other name, in that case, comfort, care, any of the words that Jenny's talking about. The notion that, in fact, it's the deep work and the work that takes many years to come to fruition that is the space of the kind of slow moments of change. I know we're all in this moment where we're trying to figure out how we might continue to contribute and take care of each other. And for us, this might be the best way to, it's often the best way to end as we talk about things, thinking about where this axis moves on after 2024 and where these threads continue to pick up the things that we've learned, the ways that we've worked with 2 people or 100 people or 500 people are all the same, right? They're all listening deeply, kind of working together, having that empathy to be able to draw from both the expertise, the lived expertise of of your clients, if we were working with, but then pair it with your own expertise. And I think this is where a lot of our conversations sit between a formal conversation about the work and how it might be articulated and a social conversation about how it's received and lived in and occupied. And our hope is that work continues to kind of swirl together as you see in this. Anything you wanted to add? I feel like this was one of our faster talks. We're usually interrupting each other and we keep going. Yeah, we're pretty,
Yeah, I mean, honestly, we're excited also to speak to students tomorrow. So if you can come to that session, Todd, you can open it up to others. But we'd really love to answer questions and
see where you're all at.
This is also us kind of opening, pulling back the curtain on how you operate in between these sort of self-motivated projects, in between having real clients. You become your own client, you work through things at different scales, and try to sort of connect or pull between these concepts that maybe only reveal themselves after the fact also.
Okay, so thank you for having us, listening, and we'd love to talk. And we have this, right? Yeah.
Okay, I will open to questions. I know that there is a lot of 419 housing people that probably want some advice.
Thank you so much for your lecture. I have a question about your co-housing project and especially your role as the architect, because you said it took like 6 years to get that project basically from start to finish. And I just wonder, in terms of your involvement with the families, you said there were 30 units. Yeah. That means there were even more people involved probably, and always different people involved, I assume. So I wonder what your experience was as an architect sitting at the table with these 30 units, how that was for you.
I think number one is we learned to truly participate in consensus through that model and to actually feel the weight of what consensus is. We were lucky in that so many co-housing communities operate in this consensus model. So basically, everyone moves along, and if a decision has to be made, if you are in agreement, you don't say anything. But if you have an issue, you can stop the whole process. So one person saying, I'm not comfortable, I don't like this, or I'm not interested in this, whatever the thing is, stops the process. And the conversation has to revolve then around how do we resolve that issue. This puts a lot of pressure on the individual to use discernment in stopping the process. But it also puts a lot of pressure on us as designers then to make sure that we are listening to all the voices. I should say we had 15 workshops through the process of this project. It became like our sort of second nature. On a Saturday, we would be, in a church hall or in like a VFW hall working with everyone. And it put a lot of emphasis for us on the idea that when we would have a workshop and listen, we would go away, we would write a report, we would have all of these documents of the actual sort of pieces of Post-it notes and conversations, and we would have to then process all of the voices. So it wasn't that they had just voted and there was one single answer. Our design expertise then had to take the conversation, process it, and give it back, feed it back to everyone and make sure that what we heard the right thing. And that was a kind of incredible process. And that was different each time.
One other thing I would say is that, so there's 30 households There are 29 different unit types. There's basically only one.
Wasn't on purpose.
Not on purpose. I mean, things were stacked in terms of like where plumbing
Bathrooms and
was,
kitchen,
et cetera. But through all of the workshops, people had to like really, really tell themselves, no, I'm not just designing my singular unit, even though in the end, you could almost say things were purpose-built. So they didn't actually choose their units until the building was under construction. And so this question of like, in every workshop, not just having your own interests, but having the interests of the group, I think that was the most incredible thing to see. So comments were being made that like became about reinforcing the stated values that were like in the mission statement of the group, not just individual desires. So I don't know, that was incredible.
It was not as wrought of an experience, though, as one might imagine. That's what was interesting, because there was a stated process and there was a willing
Yeah,
group.
and there were
I
like,
think.
there was a moderator at every discussion, you know, would have someone who would call on people, and, you know, it was great. Yeah.
But it also meant, sorry, I should say,
Yeah.
the last thing is, we didn't cede our design expertise, right? It wasn't, what does everyone want it to look like? It was a sort of like, here are ways in which we can imagine this project, here's a vocabulary we can all use together, and as we work together, we can help guide that, and that actually was an incredible learning process, I think, for us as well.
And part of the design process was the fact that the building had to be totally redesigned because there was a building moratorium, which literally meant, you know, there was no active zoning code, and when the moratorium ended, basically when you could build again, file for a permit, they had downzoned. So we tried, you know, exactly. We tried to get the building approved with a 4-story design. It got rejected. We had to totally redesign the building. So this sort of like this moment of crisis, I think, was also kind of actually brought everyone together. Yeah.
I know this well, having to run with the mic, sorry.
Thank you very much. And I was going to follow up, and I'm glad you brought up the not ceding your expertise, because I think that's so often a case that, you know, the clients are coming to us as professionals for that reason, to be able to provide them expertise, just the same way you walk into a lawyer's office and you're like, you know, I'm not a lawyer, so I need one. Thank you. Could you expand a little bit more? I mean, obviously you've talked about a trajectory that's largely for an academic office, but you must have learned a lot about how to keep an office running through this process. There's a ton of variables given this client base. And from my experience of not having specifically worked with this, but having colleagues that have worked in co-housing, the benefit is it's like minds that have come together to start. So there's a positive starting point that they're already working together in some capacity, but with all of the iterations that you went through, I mean, it's easy to run yourself out of business. And I don't know if you could talk a little bit more about that and what you've learned through that process as well.
Yeah, it might help to characterize that, but right before that building, we had several of our clients were all developers and were doing speculative, like micro-housing buildings. And so in that case, you sort of write a tight proposal that really starts with schematic design, assumes they have a pro forma, assumes they know how many units they want. In this case, we were very aware that we had to sculpt the program, the desires, all of these pieces together. So even in writing the proposal, we sort of backtracked. We added in, it began with a concept design phase, or programming phase first, programming and vision, then a concept design phase, and then went into schematic design. And it's not that it was an inordinately expensive contract, it's just that we were then able to create all of the pinch points of when decisions had to be made and how many ways in which we would offer possibilities. And I think that was a really big piece of being able to manage it as a small office. By the way, it's just the two of us in our office. There's no there's nobody else. So all of for that 45,000 square foot building, like the two of us just did the construction documents and the CA.
That's how we didn't go out of business.
That's how we didn't go out of business.
Did all the work.
If we're being super honest,
we've
but
also paid ourselves, you know, adequately to do it. Yeah.
Exactly. So we I think looking at being realistic about the time, being realistic, and this is, I don't know, I'm probably over answering this and you get mad when I do this, but you know, we want to be home at 6. Like we don't work all night, right? So when we scoped it, we thought about what that would look like and how so much of the time was also just the contact hours of being with everyone and listening.
I mean, I appreciate that, and I think it's good for the students to hear too, because as, an educator and practitioner, I'm working all weekends and at night, and you have to set your limits and understand that we have value, and it's nice to hear. It's always, important for everybody to understand that, so. Glad you go home at 6.
To go home at 6. I mean, but part of that is then the honesty of running a practice where we're taking on probably one big project at a time. And so then a lot of
better get built.
It better get built, exactly. You're taking a big risk. But then the smaller projects become these ways in which we can continue to experiment and think through things without then that being a huge CD set that has to go out. So that's, if we can share that and be transparent about one practice model, that's how that works. Yeah. Sorry, I overshare, and Jenny always gives me a look.
It's good to overshare. No one ever tells you these things.
Yeah, no one does, right?
Thank you all very much. This was a really inspiring lecture, especially what you said about at the beginning with architects needing to be, policy advocates. That really resonated with me. But I also had a question about the Bay State co-housing, and I was wondering if you yourselves had any preconceived notions going into it, and if there was anything that just kind of shattered those, or just how we talk about co-housing in schools and academics, if there was anything that just really shocked you and made you take a step back when it came to programming or design.
That's a good question.
I think the thing that shocks me is how many of my academic colleagues are so skeptical of anything relating to living together. And everyone, basically describes themselves as a hermit who wants to, shut the world out. But I think it's just a misconception of what what the housing model is actually. And I kind of joke it's like a condo commune, right? You have your private space, and then you actually, to me, it's a lot like all the things you miss as a student, right? You miss a social collective, you miss running into people. Or, you miss, frankly, now maybe the social communities that you would see in person that are all replaced by, your Instagram and TikTok. And so out in the world where you don't have a dorm and you're not seeing people, I think we do need these kind of just accidental proximity so that your neighbors, your kids can also, the other thread throughout this that we've talked and taught about in different studios is how kids as as agents, as citizens of the world who might have their own relationships or have friendships across the building, I think is really, really an amazing thing. So, sorry, my shock was actually at how cynical people are about living together, when in fact, I think this idea of shared infrastructure, a social safety net, all of these other things that we espouse in design school are all, really part of these housing models. So, yeah, and actually the people going into the model, a lot of them are also, what I might candidly say are they're social, but they actually, I think, are helped by the structure of these governance models, right? There's a kind of overlap of there's all different personality types, but I think the sort of thriving within certain structured socializing or format where you have a common objective, I think is also a key tool.
Yeah, maybe that was very shocking. Actually, you'd think that it was a lot of extroverts and people who were so ready to share, but in fact, it was a lot of people who
We need the Myers-Briggs profile.
Yeah, the Myers-Briggs. But they knew themselves, and they knew that to age and be happy, they actually needed more interaction, and that they'd have to literally produce an environment, be part of an environment where that was more organic. Man, no shockers though. We'll think about that more. Maybe it's the conversation between co-living, co-ops.
Oh yeah.
Co-housing that was the hardest.
Hi, so my question for you, what architectural concepts do you carry over when you are switching into different mediums?
Color, character, formal profiles, we kind of talk visually, right? We make we talk through images, and that's one thing about being sisters is like we just have a lot of the same, like, you know, our tapes are kind of overlapping, our mental tapes. So we relate, and I mean, I think we do this in teaching too, that we kind of talk through shapes and forms, and a lot of those things just sort of loop back. I know that's not a very satisfying answer, but I mean, depth perception, flatness, the
probably the biggest
teapots.
thing, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, the housing projects, at least in the Northeast, wood construction is kind of dominant. And so really flat elevations are, and designing of elevations is something we're interested in, and kind of one of the last things, or the sort of forgotten things, I think, in school often. So we kind of like thinking about 3 dimensions, but through flatness a lot.
Yeah, I think you're right to say character more so than figure or form. Like character comes before figure and form as we talk. And that might be literal character, like this reminds me of this movie, versus, or it might be character of this needs to feel both soft and structured at the same time, right? These are the kinds of verbal, like the conversations we have that then we start those image searches to kind of produce and think through that character. Good questions.
And we have the Google Chrome, you know, Pinterest extension, and all my students say Arena, but I don't want to pay for Arena, so I just make my own Pinterest boards for everything. And as the mic moves, actually, you know, that's one thing that is really important with clients, is realizing that we might be saying the same thing, but we're not seeing the same thing. Yep. So actually, like, putting up images and then more images, because sometimes we show a picture and they say, oh, I love that lamp in the corner. I said, no, that's not what we were looking at. Anyways.
You talked a little bit about the challenges you've had with color decisions. I wondered if you could expand on that a little bit. You know, the pink and the pastels are often colors that we associate with the interior, and you put them on the exterior. And it's also, I think, color palette of the time in some ways. And we see other architects like Moss and Paul Atelier using similar color palette. But it's also, you know, historically, these are colors that we associate with women. And maybe it's not such a binary of being feminine, masculine, or interior, exterior, but it seems that you are challenging the conventions somehow. Could you talk about that?
We might talk about it as color at the confluence of, sorry, I'm not trying to, for alliteration here, but color at the confluence of consensus and our own interests. So something like the co-housing project, we were afraid at first that that bringing too much color into the conversation might start to get very controversial. But in fact, they were relieved. They were worried that as architects, we were going to propose everything be white, right? And that in fact, the kind of conversation we categorize things as being, this one's colorful and cheerful, this one is bright, this one is soft. Yeah. And they were very excited about colorful, cheerful, bright, but then it was finding attaching the word to those things. I'm trying to think of the best way to describe. Sorry, it's just that idea of consensus is often a conversation that we have first together. It is an intuition, to be honest, what we like, and then sharing it with other people. I think we're often really surprised that there's a similar attraction to these sort of like the combination of a hot pink and then a sort of pastel.
I think some of it is about abstraction too for us, like how we have been imagining a building form, and then whether or not that still maps to the kind of the abstract version of it, how detailing of, like, you know, windows, making sure that trim doesn't become something that dominates, like, you know, this is all, sorry, that's not on the big screen, it's a restart. Detailing, like making hardy plank, right, which is just cementitious clapboard, which is on every, you know, 5/2 building across America, making it do something that it might not always want to do, using scale of different, you know, spacing, but also the trim in the windows, allowing some of that abstraction to come through with the color, I think is part of it.
Which has a technical aspect too. So like when we were picking pink, In fact, if you use cementitious board, if you use some of the board that we're using on the trim, I don't know, this gets really technical, but there's a reflectance number that's given to paint colors, right? And so some of the trim that we were using for all of the windows, had it gone any darker or brighter, would have caused it to heat up, caused the material to heat up and start to bend, right? So we actually had to stay within certain worlds in order to keep that softness. And it just so happens, you're absolutely right, that then that perfectly graphs to a kind of cultural moment and an interest in, and the gender piece, I think, is, we're sort of guilty as charged.
Interestingly enough, on the right here is another garage that's about to be under construction in Haymarket in Boston, right, where we could get magenta, on the actual building, because the City of Boston, our Office of Arts and Culture, got involved and became this kind of actually great intermediary for us to get what we wanted when the sort of development team was more interested in a return to safe gray everywhere. So I think that
You're avoiding the gender question.
I mean, yeah. No, well, I mean, the implication
Yeah, the implication
was that this was incredibly controversial to put pink on this building. As an otherwise, $1 billion Caesar Pelli building they just put up, and then the thing that they're really worried about is this magenta garage screen. Yeah. Literally $1 billion building, yes.
I'm going to stick to this kind of topic. I mean, I'm really interested in co-housing and sort of infrastructural efficiencies and that kind of thing. But one thing that stuck out to me as you were talking about that building is you described what it looks like now. You said hammocks and busyness and kids. And so I'm interested in a little bit how you present the projects and maybe show them in their pure state rather than in their performative state. Mm-hmm. Even when you guys are the scale figures, right? It's very precise.
Yep.
But you describe them really differently.
It's a really good question, and actually why we're working with our friend who's a filmmaker to go back and revisit, right? And precisely like to photograph and film the building now that it's lived in.
Yeah. But we're aware that, that requires a really good documentary, photographer, and that the sort of, so with that outlier lofts and the virtual staging, there is this kind of the moment where you're ceding control of the building right before it gets occupied, where it also is in this sort of imaginary state, right, anticipating its many lives. And there's equally something that we find distracting, I think, even in the over-inhabited rendering. And this is, we're now almost in the end stage of shoes and this sort of casually disheveled rendering, where that almost becomes a stylized distraction, I think, sometimes from the space. So it's an open question. I think it's a kind of, and then the other problem is just staging a million pieces of furniture or trying to control it is an enormous undertaking. Yeah.
Because it's a really fair question. It's a fair critique, right?
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
I think sometimes, maybe the answer is sometimes it's intentional and is a commentary on architectural representation and photography, and sometimes it is purely logistics, and it is. In the Outlier Lofts project, Jenny's right. It was a developer, and it's a speculative project. You have no control with who buys it, and they're not going to let you in and photograph, right? So that became a kind of projective process. With co-housing, it is such a long process and waiting for people to bring all of their stuff in. They literally brought all of their furniture, and whatever didn't go in anybody's individual unit came into the dining room, and it was the most amazing mess of tables and chairs, and it slowly over the last year started to become organized, and we're so interested in tracking that. But we're also aware, again, that the architectural representation doesn't exist for that, and we need to kind of invent what that process. It's probably film more so than photography, right, that will track that. I know, sometimes it's just too neat, right? It's too clean.
Yeah.
We need the messiness.
And photography is expensive, and we foot the bill ourselves. This is
We're
the
a
problem,
two-woman
right?
band.
So,
You could give
$10,000 later that we pay for.
give each of those
to photograph
kids, right?
it.
Give each of those kids their iPhone.
Exactly.
Their iPhone and let them do it.
Yeah. I know the kid's rebuilding the car in the garage now. We gotta go. Oh. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tom.
You all.